right from the beginning, even the creators of GDP as a concept have been warning us that in fact it's a very limited model. The creators of GDP essentially made the point that in fact it was, in its current form, a very poor measure of both ecological and social parameters. The problem is that we continue to use that old model. There is a small group of people which now argue that in fact what we need to do is to retain GDP and try and reform it. And the history of this effort goes back about a decade. A fellow banker of mine, Pawan Sukhdev, and I sat down and basically began to look at GDP as a measure of, mostly to do with ecological issues, but eventually came to include social issues in it as well. And we said, is there a way that we can begin to value things like forests, pollution, education, and so on, and put dollar values to them? Why dollar values? Because if we put dollar values on them, then we can create a way of incorporating it into the national accounts. So that when we say that GDP is growing by 9%, we genuinely mean that value of 9% has been grown. Because right now the way that we measure things is, for example, if we cut down a forest, for example, the current measure of GDP will show it as an addition to GDP when you and I know that in fact we have destroyed value. We have destroyed biodiversity, we have destroyed flood control, we have destroyed carbon sequestration, we have destroyed all kinds of value, and yet the current GDP format wouldn't take this into account. And we found that in the 90s, a number of economists had indeed attempted in small bits to try and place value on some of these things. So what we did is we picked those up and began to try and see if we can weld them into a system, a methodology that was consistent both internally as well as consistent with the way national accounts was being done by CSO and others. Then, once having discovered that it was actually possible, we said, okay, let's try and apply it to some country. The obvious thing, of course, to do was to apply it to the simple country, like a small country somewhere, but we said, no. Let's apply it to the most complicated country possible, India. And not only are we going to apply it to India, we're going to do it by state. And we got hold of a team in Chennai at the Madras School of Economics and one team at IEG, that's the Institute of Economic Growth in Delhi. And Pawan and I and these two teams worked for several years. And slowly we built up a series of monographs spelling out a methodology by which we could recalculate a green GDP. By green, I don't only mean, by the way, ecological issues like non-timber forest reserves or water or pollution and so on, but also things like education, health, and so on. And also, by the way, mining, because people do not realize mining, the act of mining itself, adds actually no value at all. All you're doing is converting wealth which is under the ground and pulling it out. It's like saying that you're selling your family jewelry and creating income. You don't. All you're doing is converting wealth into an income stream. So then, once we got these, we calculated these, and we discovered that the numbers that we were generating were massive. I'll give you one example. The value of water pollution in the state of Uttar Pradesh is the value destruction of it is worth 17% of that state's GDP. So it's not a small number. And by the way, even the water pollution alone in that state. And the additions also are pretty large. I mean, for example, the value addition from the growth of primary education in the last decade in many states in the country, including, by the way, interestingly, Bihar, I didn't realize this, was actually pretty large. So the point is, if we correctly calculated GDP, we would end up with a completely different picture from what we were actually measuring. And it's quite possible that that picture is better than what we are measuring. But the fact is, if we don't measure it, we don't know. The good news is that this methodology is now getting adopted increasingly by many, many groups around the world. The Supreme Court of India is using some of our work and methodology for some of the environment and forestry related cases. In fact, the Campa funds, which you may have heard of, much of those values that are being used for that are done using our methodology. This is just an example of one paradigm of thinking that once you shift out of and begin to work and you realize that, with relatively less effort. I mean, there were just two amateur bankers sitting on weekends doing this. You can have huge impact. But I'll give you another example of a paradigm shift, mental paradigm shift. Some of you may not agree with me, but nonetheless, I think it's fair that we begin to at least question this. And this is the idea that somehow India is fundamentally a rural country. Mahatma Gandhi, about 80 years ago, made a statement that India lives in its villages. And I think it was not a statement or a statistical statement. Of course, India at that time lived mostly in its villages. It was a statement about the soul of India. But the fact is that well within my lifetime, India will be an urban majority country. Something like 350 million people will move into some sort of an urban space in the next 30 years. Now, whether we like it or not, this is going to be the single biggest social, economic, ecological change that we will witness. The standard approach to this, unfortunately, both from activists and most policymakers, is that somehow this is a bad thing. I think that comes from not thinking about urbanization at all. Urbanization does not have to be only about everybody from Bihar moving to Bombay. There are many models of urbanization, and we need to think about this. For example, in Germany, Germany is almost entirely urbanized, but it has no really large cities. I mean, Frankfurt is a tiny city. So there are many models of urbanization. You can think in terms of very decentralized urbanization happening by urbanizing our villages, for example, and so on. But this is a debate I would like to open up, but the point I'm trying to make here is this. If we do not think about urbanization very, very seriously and quickly and take it on, rather than try and discourage it or ignore it, then all we will get is more of what we are seeing, which is a completely dysfunctional growth of cities. I've just given you two examples of mental frameworks. I think it's extremely important that we think about this. The reason I think this from a peace angle is this, that peace is about the absence of violence, but it doesn't have to be violence between nation states or violence between ethnic communities. Mass poverty is a form of violence. Intellectual frameworks, policy frameworks that perpetuate mass poverty are a form of violence. Ecological degradation is violence against future generations. So if we are thinking peace, we've got to begin to question the frameworks that are the basis of this form of development. It is not an easy thing to do, but I think every generation needs to do this. With that, let me pass it back to Rajni.
Thank you, Sanjeev. I must say, that was very, very sharply put. And I would just add to that with the one example that I think is on everybody's mind here just now, that the car, the automobile at one time, well, actually about exactly 100 years ago,
Yes.
came to symbolize progress.
Yes.
And certainly post-war societies took that as one of the main symbols of moving ahead, progress. And today we are at a point where that same symbol has become an obstacle. Yes, it means moving forward in life to have your own car, but that as everybody gets more cars, we're all getting to any place we want to go at a much slower rate. So in a sense, if we look at this symbol and connect it both, and adding cars is the best thing you can do for GDP.
Yes.
Right. The production of cars, the cleaning up of the pollution they cause, the health bills.
But in fact, you've added no value at all.
In a sense. So I want to go back to Ravi. You've done a lot of work with people at the ground where you've seen the older forms of well-being being depleted or destroyed in the pursuit of these newer symbols. And how do we balance? How do we find answers out of that? Because you and I who have driven around in cars now for three generations, can't turn around to the person in the village who has been walking on foot and say that you should continue to walk on foot. Because you had your own paradigm of progress. How do we match these things and yet come out ahead as a whole, as an entire nation, not just segments?
Going back about 20 years, people in Delhi began to realize that the car was creating a lot of pollution. Today you have a situation where 10% of the school-going children or 13% of the school-going children in Delhi are asthmatic. What few people recognize even today is that all that pollution doesn't sit just on top of Delhi. You come to where I live, up in the Himalayan region, you cannot see the snow-capped Himalayas on an average day. You have to be lucky to see the snow-capped Himalayas from where you saw them 15 or 20 years ago. You could see them every day because that pollution cloud comes over the plains of UP, where all the Terai belt forests got decimated, and that pollution cloud goes and hangs in front of those tall peaks and hides them. So when the situation finally dawned on people in Delhi that, look, we are literally harming our own selves, that's when a new search began, which still wants to get people from one place to another place quickly, but not by using cars. So you got the metro rail system over there. In many cities of the world, which are of these mega-sized cities, not the Frankfurt so much as the Mexico City or Rio, Sao Paulo, these kinds of cities, they have experienced these problems and they've moved away from the cars. I wouldn't say to that villager who wants to buy a Nano, I'm not so worried about that person. I'm more worried about what's going on in the metropolitan cities. 20 years ago, when I moved to Dehradun, I could do the Delhi-Dehradun trip in 5 hours. Today we have 4-lane highway, and that time we did not, we had a single-lane highway. Today that trip takes a minimum of 6.5 hours, and that's in the non-peak hour traffic. Okay? So it's not anymore a quick means of transport either.
That's right.
And this is what we need to educate ourselves. I would not worry so much about the poor person.